back. Today I want to talk about a piece of music that on its first performance created an absolute riot. Well, that's at least how it was described 2 years later. Although it's quite clear during its first performance in Paris in 1913, it certainly did cause a great stir. There was a lot of hissing, booing, even a little bit of violence in the hall. And some say that Diaghilev, the person who was in charge of the Ballet Russe at the time, had stirred this up to get more attention. Who knows? And that will all come back to later. Anyway, today in this recording, I'm talking about, of course, Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, Le Sacre du Printemps, as it is known in French. Now, why do I say that in French? Because the first performance was in France, and generally it is known in the world as under its French title. But to illustrate this incredible piece of music, which definitely changed the direction of 20th century music in 1913, I've got 5 recordings, one from Claudio Abbado, one from Klaus Makela, a very recent one from 2023. I have also got Bernstein, and I've got Rattle, and I've also got Igor Stravinsky himself, because he conducted it himself in 1960 with the Columbia Symphony Orchestra, which is an orchestra which the Columbia record label actually created. It was largely based on musicians from the Los Angeles Phil and also from New York and other people. Anyway, that's all coming up. We will compare and contrast and listen and see what the different techniques were and tempi and all the rest of it. But before all that, as always, just a very, very short, brief overview on Igor Stravinsky. Who was he? Well, Igor Stravinsky was born in 1882 on the 5th of June. He comes from a sort of, should we say, he was Russian, but his father was Polish. His father was an opera singer, and his mother was an amateur pianist and also a singer. And his father came from, I think, from land-owning class, shall we say, in Poland. What more can I say? Yes, he had, I think, 3 siblings. The older 2 he didn't get on with at all, but he got on very well with his younger brother, and that kind of was very informative, because I think his father was quite strict and severe, and I do think he struggled a little bit in his childhood, to say the least. But Stravinsky, although he comes from a musical background and he studied all the usual things, piano and violin and all the other bits and pieces that you would expect a young musician or somebody in a musical family to try and do, he was experimenting. He was definitely into sort of composition, but as I say, it wasn't in the traditional sense with lots of lessons in that subject. His father obviously, I think, wanted him to become a lawyer, because when he went to St. Petersburg University, he did actually study law, although it seems that he didn't turn up for many of the lectures. But he met a young man there at university called Vladimir, and Vladimir's family name was Rimsky-Korsakov. And if you know, recognize that name, it is, of course, the Russian composer, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, the famous Russian composer. He was the son of that composer. And during one holiday or whatever, Stravinsky, Igor, goes with Vladimir to meet his father, and Stravinsky shows his father some of the compositions that he's working on. And although Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov saw the works, and saw that they were a little bit, should we say, naive, whatever, or they could do with, he could see that there was a real natural talent there, and he strongly encouraged Stravinsky to keep going. And in fact, he began tutoring Stravinsky, and he did so for the rest of his life until he died in 1908. So the young Stravinsky, haha, what can we say? He married his first cousin, which actually wasn't allowed. I think it was the Catholic Church who had abolished that a long time earlier. But he did it not secretly, but he had a way of doing it, organizing it, and he managed to pull it off anyway. And he married his wife in 1906. They had 4 children together. And in 1921, Stravinsky began an affair with a Vera de Bossé, who was a dancer. By this time she was a dancer in New York. So this affair was going on, and I mention it because eventually they end up getting married. But by the time, there's sort of 3 periods in Stravinsky's life. There's the Russian period, there's a period when he lived in France, and then there's a period when he lived in America. And certainly in my American times, he had lost quite a lot of his income because of the war. His copyrights and the royalties he would have got from European sort of dried up. So he did a lot of conducting. He played the piano and gave concerts. So yes, he kept himself very, very busy with those things. And that's indeed why we have so many recordings of his own works conducted by him. And he did get Boosey and Hawkes, the publishers, to sort of republish some of his earlier works. So it wasn't all hopeless, not by any means. But now let's get to the piece of music itself. Le Sacre du Printemps, as they say in French, and the original title was written in French because it was first performed, as I say, in Paris in the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées on the 29th of May in 1913. Now, how did all this come about? So you imagine the young Stravinsky studying with Rimsky-Korsakov in Russia, and there's a guy called Sergei Diaghilev, and he was heading up what he called, and a group of people called Ballet Russe. Now Diaghilev, he was famous, a little bit radical. He had already asked Stravinsky, before this piece was written, to write 2 pieces for a performance each year. 1910 and 1911. In 1910 you have the Firebird, and then in 1911 you have Petrushka. So these were ballets, of course, but the big difference here for the 1913 production is that Stravinsky's music had moved on. Should we say it's not really atonal in the sense of, we think of modern day contemporary music. But it was still a little bit shocking for the time. But the real shock, and I think the real problem at the first performance, wasn't actually the music as such. I think it was Nijinsky's choreography. Now, obviously, Václav Nijinsky was a very, very, very famous ballet dancer, famous over the whole world. And Diaghilev asked Nijinsky to choreograph this piece. And so, Nijinsky was very young. He was 24 at the time, and he had these lots of wild and crazy ideas. And I think in many ways it was that caused the problem, because instead of the Parisian audience getting the beautiful ballerinas and the hero and the anti-hero and the love and the romance and the passion and the beautiful sets, they got dark, dismal, folklorish sets with dancers sort of moving around the stage, sort of hovelled up and not. There was no glimmer of hope in this work at all. So where did the idea for the work come from? Well, it seems to have come from that Stravinsky was very interested in Russian folklore, and it probably goes back a few hundred years. And the concept is that there was this folklore story that in the Rite of Spring, that a young maiden would dance and dance and dance and dance until she died from exhaustion. And that is exactly what it's depicting. Now, obviously, you can talk about that on lots of other levels. And if you want to know more about Igor Stravinsky, the work, and all his other works and his life, I can definitely recommend a book by Michael Oliver, just called Igor Stravinsky, and it's published on Phaidon. It's a very interesting, very easy book to read if you want to get into his life. But I think that will do it for now. What I need to say on the orchestration side of it, Stravinsky put a big demand on his orchestra. He had demanded for 8 horns, 4 trumpets, 3 trombones, a big string section. As you'll see, I'm going to put a link in to a video with Sir Simon Rattle conducting the work, and you see how big the orchestra is. Really a massive orchestra. But although it is a big orchestra, a great deal of the work is almost chamber in style, because you will find it's just a few instruments playing together, little ensembles, and then ever so often it breaks out into the big orchestra, as it says. Okay, so look, let's get on with playing you some of the music. Now, I have decided to use the Klaus Makela, or Klaus Makela as some people call him, with the Orchestra de Paris. I thought, well, the Orchestra de Paris, why not? It's the right location. Also, this is a 2023 recording, so really quite a recent recording. And so I thought, well, on Decca, usually very high quality. So I'm going to use this as the bass. I'm not going to play all the pieces because there's like 8 movements. You have to see it as scenes or episodes in the ballet. But when it's played as a concert piece, which it often is done today, and I have to say that in 1914, Stravinsky performed this again in Paris in 1914, I think once in Russia just before, then in 1914, and then he was considered a hero, and he was sort of carried through the hall on the shoulders of his friends and supporters, and it became a very, very popular concert piece just 1 year after its initial performance. So that does kind of lead us into thinking that it was more the stage set, the lighting, the costumes, the posture of the dancers, and the fact that the elegance had gone. I think those things together created the problem in the beginning. So I want to use, I'm not going to play every part because there's 8 parts in the first, I think 8 in the first, and then we've got, depending how you calculate the scenes, if you include the introduction, of course, and then there's 6 in the second movement. It's in 2 parts, but again, as a concert piece, it's just played straight through. It's about 35 minutes long, if I'm not mistaken. So let's start off with the very opening, with the bassoon playing right up in its upper register. Could be confusing to think of it as being an oboe. Here we go. Now that's Klaus Makela's introduction. Let's compare that now with Claudio Abbado. Now the Claudio Abbado recording was in 1975. And I think it's interesting because it's with the London Symphony Orchestra. And it's considered to be a pretty important recording, I have to say. It's listed generally as a recording to be taken, not seriously isn't the right word, but it's one of the more, at the time it was very well received, and I think it stands up to modern time. Let's just listen to his introduction. So again, immediately, what do we see as a difference between the two? We see that the Makela version seems much nearer, doesn't it? The sound of this one is further away. Let's just go back to the Makela again and just listen again here. And now the Abbado. Now this is a class that is called the introduction, and indeed it is obviously an introduction. And it just creates this nice eerie scene at the beginning. And what I want to do now is go on to the very famous bit, which if you know this work that we know, where we have this an amazing sounding part in the whole orchestra comes in with this very strong rhythmic section. You can call this really the rock and roll of classical music. And when it first came out, it must have been like, for me, when I first heard Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. When I first heard that, I thought, oh my God, you know, it was like shocking, and the anarchy in the UK, it just shocked me to the core. And maybe that's what it was like for the Rite of Spring to the Parisian audience at that time. Let's just hear Klaus Makela with opening part one, obviously, the Augurs of Spring, the dances of the young maidens. Let's listen to see how this sounds. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, this is such a great work. If you want to get the dust off your hi-fi system, just give this a blast. It's absolutely brilliant. Now, let's just compare that then with I see how Abbado handles that opening piece. Come on, let's just have a quick little listen to this one. Okay. Okay, but listen to now. I'm going to bring in Leonard Bernstein. And what year was this? 1972. Again, I think the London Symphony Orchestra, if I'm not much mistaken. Yeah, the London Symphony Orchestra. We got the same orchestra, 1972, with Bernstein. Let's see how he handles this piece. And you'll notice it's going to be very, very different. Listen to this. It's very fiery, but there's sort of like an echo effect, isn't there, on those really strong beats. I don't know if that's a recording technique, if it's the way he's playing it within the orchestra, but it's incredibly different. Okay, now we're going to hear Igor Stravinsky's 1960s recording. Let's see what this one sounds like. the details on that. Here, the little pizzicato. So it's great. You go straight from this big symphonic thing with all the orchestra together to the little sort of almost chamber, as I say, with a little pizzicato on the violin. Fabulous. Now that brings us with one more recording I want to bring in to show you on this, which obviously is Simon Rattle, Sir Simon Rattle, we should say. And this is with the Berlin Philharmonic, and it's 2013. I just needed to check the date on that one, 2013. So a fairly modern recording. But the sound of this is completely different. I warn you in advance, you'll find it's a much fuller, warmer, deeper, lots more lower mid in the recording. The mix is quite different. Have a listen to this. I love it. I mean, I just think this is a great performance. It's very different from the others. Now, lots of people comment about, oh, you know, the only way to play it is this way or that way, and this is the truth, and people should play it just like it's written or how the composer intended. Well, here we've got the composer himself conducting. And in a later video coming up soon, I'm going to talk about the interpretation of music and how a musician has to convert what is essentially binary things written on a piece of paper into real music. I think it's an interesting topic, and I want to share that with you soon in the Great Recordings session. But for now, we have to understand that everyone's interpreting it in their own way, and maybe if Stravinsky was playing it in 5 different dates or different periods of his life, he would perform it differently too, and he would probably perform it differently depending which orchestra, which hall that they're working in. So there we go. That's sort of, we're now got into part 1. We've kicked off with in a real sense. Let's go back to Klaus Makela, and I'm going to play you now apart from part 2, which is the mystic circles of the adolescence. It's really beautiful, and I've chosen this part because just to show you the sort of contrast you can expect in the piece itself. Here we go. Lovely rhythm, these mystic circles. You really get that feeling of a circular rotation here. Let's see how Claudio Abbado handles that. A bit quicker. So the horns are a little bit more prominent there, aren't they? You can hear them in the background. Now we're going to move on to Igor Stravinsky himself conducting the Columbia Symphony Orchestra in the same section. Here we go. see how this is a quicker tempo, very different sounding from the others. Let's just move on now to Sir Simon Rattle with the Berlin Philharmonica, and let's just see how he handles that same piece. Now, you see, he's playing this very, very differently. And did you notice that he's bringing the volume up on each note? Bum, da, da, bum. With all the strings are moving like one instrument, coming up and bringing the volume up and doing it all the way through. So not only have you got this circular pattern, which was very clear with the macula, you've also got that at the same time coming up with that increase of volume. And you only can do that with a really well-rehearsed orchestra that are very, very tight to get that very even sound. And you're just getting the little hint of the horns in the background there. I hope you're finding this comparison interesting. Now we're going to move on to, which is actually part 2, scene, if you like, 11. The glorification of the chosen one, something very, very different. We're back to Klaus Makela. Have a listen to this. So I should have warned you, but it's just great. Now, if you think about a lot of film music which came later, I'm thinking of things like, Bernard Herrmann's scores for Hitchcock. This is typically the kind of sounds that you would hear. And I find it absolutely fascinating that here we are in 1913, just before the war, and this must have been very, very radical in its time. Okay, so what I want to do now is play the Claudio Abbado version of the glorification of the chosen one, to see how he takes it. And now we're pre-warned as to just what kind of beginning this is going to have. Wow, this is really obviously a very, very, very powerful piece indeed. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to the ritual of the ancestors. We're just going to play you a little taster of that back with Klaus Makela, because I think it's interesting here just to get a difference of the different tonal structures that are built in this piece. Here we go. Isn't that lovely? So the Rite of Spring has so many different colours and contrasts in it. And what I'm going to do now is fast forward to the last part, the sacrificial death, or the beginning of that, with Klaus Makela. It shows you really, again, we're back in the beginning of the end for this poor, wretched young woman as she begins this sacrificial dance. Here we go. I think it's now the time to bring Igor Stravinsky back onto the podium, because it's his work, it's his conducting. He knows it better than anyone. And let's just see how he begins the last movement of his work, the Sacre du Printemps, the Rite of Spring. Here we go. It's such a great recording, really. This is a snapshot of a moment in time. We have one of the most important pieces of the 20th century, written, composed in the 20th century, a piece of music that changed classical music forever, conducted by the composer with the Columbia Symphony Orchestra, members and musicians from all different orchestras, or maybe, as I said earlier, the Los Angeles and the New York Phil and others. What a gift, what a thing that we have here, this time machine that we call our hi-fi music hobby, whatever we want to call it. Let's just move to the end, because the end, if you don't know it, is quite dramatic. And in the words of T.S. Eliot from The Hollow Men, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. And I have a feeling this is how the Rite of Spring ends, if you had to put it into words. Let's just give it a go. The Sacre du Printemps, The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky. I hope this has inspired you to dig out your own version or the versions that you like. Please put them in the comments below, because it's always interesting for me and for the other viewers to see recordings that you think are very, very special. As I said earlier, I will put a link into the Simon Rattle, or one of the Simon Rattle's performances you can see on YouTube. But if you have been, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Enjoy the music.